All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this second event in the autumn edition of PHO2, the joint research seminar of the Center for Philosophical Studies of History and Center for the Philosophy of Historiography. My name is Georg Gangl, and I will be today's moderator. More importantly, today's speaker is Henriikka Hannula with the topic Existential Historicism, the Rise and Fall of a Sense-Making Framework. Henrique is currently a postdoctoral researcher in the project The Rise and Fall of, oh no, sorry, The Crisis of Philosophy in the 1930s at the University of Geneva, Switzerland. Her main research interests lie in the history of philosophy and the philosophy of history. And we will hear about both today, I think, in her talk. Also, Henrique is one of the world-leading experts on Willem Dilthey and his philosophy, on whom she also wrote her PhD thesis. Of Henrikka's publications, I only want to mention two here. One is Wilhelm Dilthey on historical understanding, which came out in 2023 in the Proceedings of the Philosophical Society of Finland. And the other one is Georg von Wright on Understanding and Explanation, which was published in 2022 in the anthology History of Understanding Analytic Philosophy. Now, after today, we'll still have three events in our autumn seminar on June, no, not June, on December 4. Ephraim Wallach from the University of Jerusalem will be speaking about Is the Past Real? Question mark. Then on December 18, Fons de Wolf from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology will give the talk Reading in Historiography and Iterative Measurement, Atheism, Forgery, Cannibalism, and Deification? Question mark. And then finally, on January 28th of next year, Hermann Paul from the University of Leiden will be speaking on epistemic success in historical studies, truth, truthfulness, and true then. Now, if you want to stay updated about our events, please consider following our social media of both of our centers. There we publish more timely information about our talks and also other events. Now, very shortly, technicalities. Please mute yourself during the talk to avoid any unnecessary disturbance. I think most of you already did so, which is great. And then there will be a discussion session after Henriikka's talk, which will last about 50 minutes, I think, which I will moderate. In the discussion session, please first raise your digital hand over Zoom. I will make a speakers list. When it's your turn, you can either speak up with or without your camera on, or write your question or comment or concern in the chat, and I'll read it out loud. And we will prioritize people who have not spoken yet, so they will move up on the speakers list. That was already from me. Thank you very much, Henriikka. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm gonna share my PowerPoint presentation. Just a second. Yes, you can see the first slide, I suppose. Yes.
Yes.
Good. So thanks for having me, and I would love to be either in Oulu or in Ostrava, but unfortunately, no, I'm in Vienna, which is also fine. But yeah, next time. So the title of my talk, as we already heard, is Existential Historicism, the Rise and Fall of a Sense-Making Framework. So getting into it right away, in his famous 1876 essay, The Use and Abuse of History for Life, Friedrich Nietzsche diagnoses that his contemporary Germany is suffering from a malignant or consumptive historical fever. According to Nietzsche, the Germans had become so absorbed with the past that they had forgotten that they could and should also take the future into their own hands. He particularly criticizes the so-called antiquarianism that he claims has taken over the universities. This antiquarianism was an attitude that reduced history to a sterile preservation of facts and traditions, and instead of this, Nietzsche called for a life-affirming engagement with the past. Of course, one should not take Nietzsche at face value, ever, but I think he was undoubtedly correct about at least one thing. I don't think that there has ever been a society that has been more preoccupied with history, historiography, or the question about their significance for life than Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century. So my talk today has two argumentative levels. First, metaphilosophical, or maybe better said, a level that has to do with the historiography of philosophy, and second, philosophical historical level, meaning that I am also making arguments about history of philosophy. I introduce a concept I call existential historicism as an analyst's category. I argue, obviously, since I'm introducing the term, that this is a useful category that makes certain aspects of 19th century German historiographical ideals more understandable and sheds light on the disciplinary self-understanding of history as an academic subject in the 19th century Germany. I don't neglect how difficult and complicated historical concept formation is, and I am happy to be challenged about the use and utility of existential historicism as a category later in the discussion. Because, so to say, proof is in the pudding, I use the concept to make hopefully convincing narrative about the rise and fall of existential historicism in the 19th and early 20th centuries in Germany. I argue that existential historicism informed theoretical and philosophical discourses around history and historicity. Hence, it functioned as a sense-making framework for many professional historians and philosophers. I think one can also make a broader case that it functioned kind of as a sense-making framework for German culture at large, or at least the educated cultural elites, also the so-called Bildungsbürgertum. I approach the 19th century existential historicism through three figures: Leopold von Ranke, Jakob Burckhardt, and Wilhelm Dilthey. Ranke mentored nearly all of the significant historians of his time, including Burckhardt and Dilthey, and his influence on the German conception of history is difficult to overstate. Ranke, or rather like different interpretations of Ranke, have also defined the self-understanding of history or historiography well beyond the 19th century. Jakob Burckhardt provided a model for modern cultural history, and Wilhelm Dilthey translated many of the insights of historicism into a more philosophical or systematic language. He was also the self-appointed philosopher of the so-called historical school. So I concentrate on these three figures, but I also suggest, of course, that they are representative of broader cultural and intellectual approaches to history in the 19th century Germany. In the final part of my presentation, I turn to the so-called crisis of historicism in the early 20th century, the fall of existential historicism as a sense-making framework. I make the case that the crisis was not due to the failure of historicism as an ontological or epistemological framework, but rather the collapse of historicism as a sense-making paradigm. It reflected a culture-wide disappointment in the traditionalist vision of the previous generations. Also, the relativism and tolerant attitude towards historical and cultural diversity that was the hallmark of the 19th century historicism did not give sufficiently inspiring or existentially viable vision for life in Germany after the defeat after the First World War. And here I also focus on three thinkers, Ernst Troeltsch, Martin Heidegger, and Walter Benjamin. Here too, I could have included other figures. I just take these three to be representative of kind of a mood or a vibe that translated into philosophical insights in the 20s and 30s. So, existential historicism. As I said, I use existential historicism as an analyst category. I here use the sociologist Harry Collins's distinction between actors and analysts categories. The actors categories are the categories and concepts that a group of people or an individual would have used themselves. And analyst categories then clearly are those that a historian or a sociologist, in Collins's case, uses to make sense of a particular time or a group of people or an individual. So I don't claim that existential historicism would have been an actors category. It was not a term that 19th century historians would have themselves used, or nobody identified it as an existential historicist. In the 19th century, it seems to me, even the concept of historicism was not really an actors category, even though it has later become such an important concept or category or framework for understanding German conception of history in this time. So Troeltsch and Meinecke used historicism in the 30s, and obviously later people like Iggers and Beiser have made a lot of use of the term. I also don't suggest that existential historicism would have had a systematic program. I use the term to analyze and categorize certain patterns of thought in the late 19th century Germany within the broader framework of historicism. Existential historicism is meant as a philosophical historical concept, meaning that it brings together a variety of views that share kind of a family resemblance. However, I still claim that my treatment is not purely historical, because these existential dimensions of historicism were systematically or philosophically important for both 19th century historicism and for the crisis of historicism in the 20th century. So after having laid out all the reservations for my argument, if I want to use a concept, I would need a definition. I'm not quite there yet, but the following will give you an idea of what I mean with existential historicism. So with existential historicism, I try to highlight a specific aspect of historicism, namely a general ethos that gave historical research a life philosophical or existential character. It combined the scientific ideals of academic historiography with aesthetic ideals and mediated between spiritually or religiously coded patterns of sense-making and the scientific goals of modern historiography. It also made the existential and aesthetic dimensions of historiography integral to the scientific nature of historiography. As such, it was part of the legitimation process of modern historiography and asserted the independence of history and the disciplinary identity of historiography vis-à-vis both the philosophy of history and natural sciences. So let's break down existential and historicism. First, existential. I don't want to make this too complicated here in the paper version. I do go a bit deeper into why I chose the word existential, but here I can just say that it refers to aspects that have to do with life, so existential questions around human condition. Historicism is a very difficult concept and has been defined in many different ways by many different thinkers. I am following sort of, I think, what is the accepted use of the term nowadays in the historiography of philosophy. So sociologically understood historicism usually refers to distinctly German tradition within historiography and philosophy of historiography. This tradition emphasized the autonomy of history in relation to both philosophy of history. I will clarify that philosophy of history part later. So both philosophy of history and the natural sciences. These thinkers did not necessarily call themselves historicists, but they were united by shared ideas about the philosophical foundations and value of historiography. The epistemological argument of historicism was that history had its own goals, methods, and standards of knowledge. It claimed that history cannot and may not be subsumed under philosophical systematization or treated as just raw material for abstract theorizing. So it prohibited imposing philosophical meta-historical frameworks to history, be it in the form of absolute spirit or discovering an inevitable direction of history. So in this way, historicism was like anti-Hegelian, anti-Marxist, and anti-Kantian. Historicism also denied that historical developments could be explained by appealing to natural laws or universal social laws. So historical events, people, and eras are unique and singular and must be understood as such. Ontologically speaking, historicism held that the human world and all these phenomena are shaped by historical contingencies. Therefore, they need to be examined within their specific historical contexts. In more modern terms, maybe slightly anachronistically, historicism can be said that it claimed that the human world is historically constructed. Historicists had different ideas in what sense and to what extent reality is constituted by its historicity, but they all basically rejected the notion of a fixed ahistoric essences. Historicism was also, at its core, a very humanist notion because it centered human historical existence and operated with ideas like human freedom and creativity. So existential historicism then essentially accepted the ontological and epistemological foundations of historicism and participated in their shared project of legitimizing historical knowledge as independent and important. Existential historicism also justified the existentially edifying aspects of historicism through those very ontological and epistemological commitments. However, I think it also included aspects that neither the ontological or epistemological understanding of historicism really grasps. So hence my need to highlight those aspects with this concept. I am not completely alone here. In the 1930s, the historian Friedrich Meinecke argued that historicism should be best understood as a worldview. He claimed that historicism was, first and foremost, a principle of life rather than a principle of science. For him, historicism was fundamentally the appreciation of the plurality of historical life forms and the humanistic ideas rooted in German Romanticism. I, broadly speaking, agree with Meinecke, but I try to specify more clearly how the life principle was intimately bound up with the principle of science, and also just to be a bit more systematic about the content of this existential historicism or principle of life than Meinecke was. So after taking the proper time to introduce and qualify my concepts and goals, we can now actually move to the 19th century. I start with the notion of aesthetic intuition. So aesthetic intuition was the epistemic foundation of historiography within historicism. It also served as a bridge that connected the ideas of science and art within historiography, the epistemological and existential registers of argumentation, and the empirical and hermeneutic forms of inquiry, or at least it justified these connections. It might at first glance seem strange that the movement that advocated for the scientific status of historiography and getting to things as they really were, as the famous Rankian credo goes, also placed aesthetic intuition at the center of its epistemic practice. However, within the parameters of historicist understanding of historiography, it was the precondition for good historiography. Aesthetic intuition enabled the historian to grasp the hidden unity behind, underlying the plurality of historical events, objects, and ideas. Put in sort of more classical German terms, it was the capacity of a historian to find the zeitgeist that was animating historical eras or the spirits behind historical phenomena. This epistemological capacity to intuit or feel the whole behind the singular was a basic tenet of historicist self-understanding. Wilhelm von Humboldt articulates this idea in his seminal On the Historian's Tasks, published already in 1821. And this text can, I think, be considered a foundational text for historicism. Quote, "The historian must not exclude the power of the idea from his presentation by seeking everything exclusively in his material sources. He must at least leave room for the activity of the idea." End quote. Humboldt here emphasizes that historical understanding must go beyond the sources themselves. Reading sources is not enough. Instead, he expresses a kind of classical hermeneutic principle. Historical sources gain their meaning only in relation to the larger context from which they emerge, but this context is something that needs to be understood. So kind of a circular understanding. The whole explains the parts, and the parts in turn are intelligible only as elements within that whole. So the kind of contextualization would be the more modern idea behind this, I think. So the historian needs kind of this aesthetic intuition, meaning the capacity to link details together in a coherent narrative, or rather a picture of the past. Importantly, Humboldt also in this quote, affirms the independence of historical knowledge from philosophy. He highlights how the historian must remain careful with historical judgments. Above all, the historian must take great care not to attribute to reality arbitrarily created ideas of his own, and not to sacrifice any of the living richness of the parts in his search for the coherent patterns of the whole. So this is Humboldt distinguishing himself from philosophers of history, so primarily Hegel. So the coherence or unity between the diversity is not arbitrary. It is based on a rigorous analysis of source material and something one finds out rather than imposes into historical material. So even when expressed in this sort of Geist-imbued kind of quasi-metaphysical language, the historicist conception of historiography was decidedly and often very explicitly anti-Hegelian. And it was also precisely this artistic dimension that the proponents of historicism used to argue for the scientific status of historiography. So their research was empirical rather than speculative. The aesthetic outlook complemented the empirical commitments of modern historiography, and this claim to empirical approach was, of course, the core of kind of Rankian historiography for scientific, or for being scientific. empirical historiography also emphasized careful engagement with sources, meaning documents, artifacts, and other verifiable evidence and archival work and so on. And Ranke famously was one of its most important early proponents of modern source criticism, I mean. It is always a bit kind of cheap trick to bring etymology into argumentation, but it is important to point out maybe that the term aesthetics derives from the Greek word for perception. So the link from aesthetics to empiricism isn't actually that far-fetched. Understanding the unity behind the diversity becomes kind of a hermeneutic exercise that is based on the analysis of the given, meaning the sources and other remains of the past. In other words, this geist of an era can only be found through attention to archival material and other sources, and analyzed through kind of the lens of modern source criticism and not through speculative philosophizing or kind of speculative armchair historiography, which was widespread in the 19th century. So fittingly, it was also this artistic aspect of historicism or aesthetic aspect that the philosophical critics used to criticize historians for lacking philosophical rigor. For these critics, aesthetic intuition meant a detached and insufficiently systematic approach to the past. For anyone trying to interpret history philosophically, the past must reveal something beyond the mere events themselves. So indeed, a rational pattern or a direction or progress. In Hegelian terms, when we look to the past must also look back at us rationally. So in this spirit, Hegel dismissed young Ranke, because Hegel died in 1830s. Ranke was still a very young upcoming historian. So he dismissed young Ranke's works as similar to novels. So they might be enjoyable to read, but they do not reveal the grand general design of history. They are great pastime, but not really philosophically relevant or scientifically relevant. After Hegel's death, this disagreement continued in a controversy between Ranke and Hegelian historian Heinrich Leo, who also dismissed Ranke's works as fantasies intended to entertain educated ladies. They did not show what is world historically relevant. So the standoff between philosophical and historical attitudes persisted throughout the 19th century. For example, with the so-called Schlosser controversy and the neo-Kantian criticism of historicism. And even though far from being a Hegelian, the same kind of dismissal of aesthetics can also be found in Nietzsche's assessment of antiquarian historicism. In Nietzsche's view, the antiquarian historian reveres the past as it was and finds dignity in all that is small, limited, moldy, and obsolete. The historian gives this dignity to these small things by situating them within a larger story that speaks to the reader aesthetically. However, this aesthetic attitude is, of course, stifling to life. If historical engagement is only for aesthetic enjoyment that gives existential solace and aesthetic kind of enjoyment, it stifles action and renewal. Out of this aesthetics of history emerges a reflective attitude, historical contemplation. So here, aesthetic intuition becomes a mode of understanding life, meaning it becomes properly existential and cannot be merely understood as an epistemic notion. And this is also clear from our examples. So Leopold von Ranke often spoke of historical research in a very religious register. In a letter to his brother, he portrays studying history as a process of deep immersion where the self is almost annihilated. In engaging with history, the historian, or I guess also the reader of history, becomes lost in the vastness of the past and is drawn toward the, quote, eternal father of all things who animates all things, end quote. So for Ranke, history reveals a harmonious unity within diversity, and this unity reflects the greatness of God. So for the historian who is known as the kind of father of scientific historiography, the central value of history actually was the kind of contemplative mindset that it invited and the religious/existential solace it provided. Burckhardt and Dilthey did not think of history in such explicitly religious terms, given that they were both secular, although secular in a very 19th century manner. Historicism was not a replacement for religion. That would be too simple, but it was a transposition of certain religious patterns of thought onto history. Like Ranke, Burckhardt regarded contemplation as integral to the study of history. In a letter from 1842, which I find very illuminating, he reflects on historical contemplation as both personal necessity and a methodological mode of engaging with history. He also presents it in contrast to speculative philosophizing. So, quote, "A man like me, who is altogether incapable of speculation and who does not apply himself to abstract thought for a single minute of the whole year, does best to try and clarify the most important question of his life and studies in the same way that in the way that comes naturally to him. My surrogate is contemplation, daily clearer and directed more and more upon essentials. I cling by nature to the concrete, to visible nature, and to history. But as a result of drawing ceaseless analogies between facta, which comes naturally to me, I have succeeded in abstracting much that is universal. Above this manifold universal there hovers, I know, a still higher universal, and perhaps I shall be able to mount that step one day." End quote. Burckhardt reiterates this idea in a more scholarly tone at the beginning of Reflections on History, so his lecture course on the theory of history, theory of history. He calls for approaching history always in a spirit of contemplation. He also argues that this reflective attitude can find the universal within the particular and thereby avoid doing violence to the true and the good and the beautiful. Contemplation finds universal ideals in their temporal manifestations. And only through this kind of contemplation do we have the slightest chance of approaching the so-called riddle of life. Dilthey echoes the same idea. In Introduction to the Human Sciences, he suggests that in history, quote, "as in the imagination of an artist, the universal is intuited in the particular," end quote. He extends this analogy between poetic and historical imagination. So, like the poet momentarily raises the soul of his reader above the turbulence, the sorrows and passions which he depicts into a free region of thought, the historian should aspire to do the same. A similar kind of detachment and generalization is at play in historical imagination. So history too can lift the soul above the sufferings of everyday life. Even though this aesthetic holism that I laid down earlier was foundational for existential historicism, historical contemplation was not all about marveling at the broad picture with a kind of sense of solemnity. Because this historical contemplation also, and I think very importantly, involved a sense of joy and excitement about historical diversity. It involved the capacity to find oneself in others and the ability to engage empathetically with the experiences of the people in the past. So studying or reading history becomes much like reading a novel, kind of an exercise in empathy. So the historian finds points of identification even when kind of confronted with cultural and historical distance. And at least in theory, this attitude presupposes tolerance and general goodwill toward historical and cultural differences. In this vein, Dilthey describes Ranke's historiography as exemplifying the universal sympathy for historical values, the joy in the multiplicity of historical phenomena, and the versatile receptivity for all of life. If anybody has read Ranke's historiography, that might sound a bit overblown. I at least find it quite, I can't really read the joy for receptivity for all of life in Ranke, but this was generally the received view of Ranke at the time. Dilthey also emphasizes that to behold and meditate historical life was one of the greatest privileges of his own existence. So this humanistic sensibility was a central aspect of existential historicism. When we engage with historical individuals, we are confronted with both their historical distance, so their otherness, and with the ways in which their actions, decisions, and fates kind of resonate with us. So for the existential historicists, this act of translation and empathetic engagement is a source of both joy and reverence, of intellectual excitement, and of respect for the many ways in which life can manifest. However, the question of diversity of historical ways of life naturally raises the classical problem associated with historicism, namely relativism. If phenomena are historically constructed, then nothing is truly universal or absolute. And if nothing is universal or absolute, what becomes of moral norms, laws, or ethical principles? However, within the framework of existential historicism, relativism was not really seen as an insurmountable problem. This is what I think a lot of the analysis around historicism gets wrong. So while it is true that the diversity of historical life forms can provoke existential anxiety by calling universal truths into question and relativizing moral or religious systems, it can also be interpreted as the manifestation of unity in diversity. As I have argued, this was the case for at least Ranke, Burkhardt, and Dilthey. They were all convinced that careful historical research could temper the existential threat of moral relativism. They believed that behind the diversity of historical life, there was a form of unity, even if that unity was not grounded in transcendental categories or universal moral laws. They argued that different worldviews and ways of life revealed truth in various ways, and so on. In this sense, existential historicism had universalist ambitions, even though it did not really have universalist foundations. This might seem paradoxical and be systematically unsatisfying, but it offered at least an existentially meaningful approach to history. It also mitigated some of the anxieties associated with the questions of life and morality while remaining faithful to the historicist ontological and epistemological principles. This anti-foundationalism could also be embraced as a cultural and existential resource for existential historicism. Interestingly, and this is a very short detour, the figure of Faust became a popular symbol to reflect the anxieties and self-understanding of a 19th century zeitgeist. Also, Burkhardt and Dilthey repeatedly invoke Faust. For them, Faust combined modern disillusionment and despair with a commitment to higher ideals, to things like science, art, and indeed historiography. As an identity category, being Faustian allowed both Burkhardt and Dilthey to reconcile anxieties associated with relativism with the scientific ideas of the 19th century Germany, as well as with kind of the idea of a noble quest, a noble artistic quest for unattainable truth. So in this sense, existential historicism was also expressed in cultural phenomena, ideals, and normative attitudes. The 19th century, especially the late 19th century, was also marked with a mood of widespread cultural pessimism. This mode culminated in the so-called pessimism controversy in the 1860s, 70s, 80s. This controversy was in many ways a response to Schopenhauer's philosophy and revolved around the question of whether life was worth living, or in other words, if existence is preferable to non-existence. Friedrich Beiser, the historian of 19th century German philosophy, has argued, and I think convincingly, that although the pessimists were often in the margins of academia, they had influence in the broader cultural life. So even though the controversy did not directly concern historiography, it created a cultural backdrop, an intellectual backdrop that shaped discourses on the role and purpose of history and the need for historiography to justify its own existence. For this reason, existential historicism can be read as a response both to the cultural pessimism and on a more specific scale to the pessimism controversy itself. Both Burkhardt and Dilthey were also personally drawn to Schopenhauer's philosophy. Burkhardt shared much of his pessimism, although without the metaphysical commitments. And Dilthey wrote about Schopenhauerian ethics and psychology in his Habilitationsschrift, so the second doctorate. And although direct references are rare in his later works, kind of the figure and the ideas, Schopenhauerian ideas, keep repeating in Dilthey's oeuvre later. For Schopenhauer, history was a long, troubled, and confused dream. So it was evidence that life is defined by suffering. Actually, historicists would not have disagreed entirely. History is indeed a stage in which people suffer and die in tragic ways, and even the greatest stories end in suffering and death. However, as noted earlier, History also offers material for aesthetic contemplation. Much like Schopenhauer and other pessimists advocated for aesthetic detachment as a remedy for despair, history could provide similar solace for the historicists. History too allowed one to subordinate personal concerns to the broader sweep of time and to put mundane modern anxieties into perspective. Pessimists generally denied any possibility of progress and viewed both individual and historical life as cycles of suffering. Historicists' ideas around progress were more complex, although by no means very optimistic. So most historicists would or could not endorse a straightforward notion of historical progress, given historicism's anti-speculative commitments. The principle of treating all eras as equal, what Ranke described as every era is equally close to God, implied a kind of nothing new under the sun attitude. Yet even here, the study of history offered an antidote to hopelessness. The historicist notion of progress relied on the belief that history teaches us lessons, and that informed by historical understanding, humans can shape the world, a bit like shape a new future. In this sense, historical knowledge becomes a means of understanding our capacities and building a more free and beautiful future, as Dilthey says somewhere. So it's this idea of Bildung and education and learning from history that all this could give hope for both individual and world historical progress. But it is by no means a very strong sense of kind of idea of progress. For Schopenhauer, the human condition is famously defined by a blind and insatiable will that perpetuates an endless cycle of suffering. Aesthetic experience offers a brief break from this cycle because aesthetic perception is will-less, so it's not volitional. So it suspends desire and quiets the ceaseless striving for existence. For the historicists, reading and writing history served a comparable role, so it allowed the historian to zoom out from individual suffering and adopt a broader view of humanity as a whole. In this vein, Dilthey argued explicitly that human beings could be liberated through understanding of the historical, and Burckhardt expressed a sentiment emphasizing the task of freeing oneself from trivial joys and fears in order to focus on comprehending historical development. Existential historicism invoked the comforting idea that the historian is part of a larger whole, in which personal and political struggles can be situated within a broader historical context and thereby removed from the immediacy of individual will and suffering. For Schopenhauer, the redemptive power, however, the redemptive power of art had rested on idealist metaphysical foundations. Existential historicism, by contrast, was grounded on a hermeneutic attitude, so understanding historical connections in events and empathizing with past human experiences. In this way, historicism made hermeneutic understanding an integral part of aesthetic experience of studying history. So it emphasized an active and affective engagement of the historian. So unlike the solitary, sublime experience of art in Schopenhauer, the existential solace of historicism was humanistic and communal. So it derived from the shared experience and from the sense of being with others across history, although, of course, in a highly aestheticized form. Now I am moving on the last part of my presentation. So the crisis of historicism as a crisis of meaning. In the aftermath of the First World War, the debates arose around the so-called crisis of historicism. Although this crisis manifested as a broad cultural phenomenon, it was maybe most sharply articulated by the philosopher, sociologist, and theologian Ernst Troeltsch, who described the crisis of historicism as a crisis of the general philosophical foundations and elements of historical thinking. But what in fact had happened? So why did historicism suddenly appear as a cultural existential problem when for decades it had served as the prevailing worldview of a significant part of the cultural elites? Most scholars today agree that the crisis of historicism was not really a crisis of historical methods or historiography. So people didn't suddenly in the 20th century realize that historicism implied relativism and get worried by that. Rather, the crisis of historicism was an index to a larger cultural existential crisis that was triggered by the devastation of the aftermath of the war and German loss, especially. Even though the general crisis consciousness in Weimar Germany took many forms, discourses around the crisis of history, the crisis of historicism were driven mostly by a loss of certainty and the absence of a stable historical narrative anchoring the German state. At its core, the crisis of historicism reflected a collapse of trust in the bourgeois conservative humanist hermeneutics of the previous generations. In other words, it marked the downfall of existential historicism as a meaning-making paradigm. The old values of the Bildungsbürger class, the educated elites, with their historicism, humanism, and the political traditionalism, did not fit the new, considerably bleaker mood of post-war Germany. To quote Burkhardt, genuine crises are rare. However, by every metric, Germany after the World War was going through a real crisis, which was both cultural and social, but also then became kind of a philosophical and historical. But kind of the social parts of the crisis, like around 2 million soldiers had died in the front, and those who returned, many of them carried deep psychological trauma. And of course, many soldiers were also academics, so they would come back to the universities. The Spanish flu continued to claim even more lives, and the country was ravaged by hyperinflation. So this atmosphere of devastation found its expression in the pessimism, for example, in the pessimism of Spengler's Untergang des Abendlandes, Heidegger's diagnosis of a crisis in Western metaphysics, and indeed Trölsch's doubts about historical knowledge. But these are just to name a few. Aesthetic intuition and historical contemplation no longer seemed sufficient to respond to this post-war despair, which those seemed to belong to the world of yesterday. So by the 1920s, the mood was not one of continuity, but of rupture and change, to which the old conception of history could not provide answers anymore. This, I think it's difficult to overstate kind of the feeling of, like this feeling of loss in the 20s. It was expressed by the theologian Friedrich Gogarten, for example, would describe the situation of his generation as one standing between the times. So they no longer belonged to the period coming to an end, and it was uncertain whether they would ever belong to the period yet to come. So they stood in the middle in an empty space. So this sense created a fertile ground for a reorientation of philosophy. It called for rejecting the old Schulphilosophy, so old academic philosophy, and in some cases, the entire history of philosophy. It is therefore not really surprising that much of this critique of philosophy and critique of Schulphilosophie took the form of critique of historicism, because it had been such an important part of the kind of self-understanding of academia in the previous century. In the remainder of the talk, I discuss 3 critiques of historicism, which I frame as critiques of existential historicism rather than its epistemological or ontological claims. So I focus on Trölsch, Heidegger, and Benjamin, as I already mentioned. Trölsch diagnosed the crisis of historicism as a general crisis of values. So a groundlessness in the face of an anarchy of values and worldviews. So basically a worry about relativism. However, Trölsch never really lost faith fully, at least in the promises of existential historicism, especially the idea of discovering a common divine primal cause in history. So in contrast to Heidegger and Benjamin, Trölsch was still more closely aligned with the previous generation of philosophers, historians, and theologians. His magnum opus, 1922, Historicism and its Problems, was even dedicated to Dilthey. Trölsch remained committed to the ethical and existential value of history and certain liberal optimism about the future. He also ultimately believed in the compatibility of historicism with religious truths. However, his faith in historicism was much less secure than that of, say, Ranke, and his reflections carried much more anxiety and uncertainty. And of course, Trölsch wrote 800 pages about the problem of historicism, while for Ranke, this problem never really existed. Trölsch himself diagnosed the seismic shift the First World War had caused and the failure of existential historicism to answer new problems. Quote, World War and revolution became practical historical lessons, Anschauungsunterricht, of the most terrible and tremendous force. We no longer theorize and construct under the protection of an order that upheld everything and rendered even the boldest or most audacious theories harmless. Instead, we are in the midst of the storm of the world's remaking, where every older world can be tested for its practical effect or its ineffectiveness, where countless things have become mere phrases and paper that once seemed, or indeed truly were solemnly serious. The ground sways beneath our feet, and all around us swirls the most diverse possibilities of what may come next. So Trölsch and his generation were looking for a future, but they were terrified of the kind of abyss looking back. Although the historicism of the older generations had not promised transcendental progress, it at least had implicitly suggested that life would go and life would continue, historical life would continue as it always had. So the march of history would consist of events rather than upheavals, and nothing truly new could occur, and that everything would be therefore kind of manageable. So this harmonious ideal of unity no longer seemed credible after the destruction of the war and amidst the political instability of the 1920s and 30s. Following the devastation of the war and Germany's catastrophic defeat, history could no longer serve as a repository of lived experiences that might enrich one's horizons. The consolation once offered by historical reflection now appeared hopelessly outdated in the new era and did not make sense of the use of history for life. As I said, Trölsch did not abandon historicism. He accepted its basic ontological and epistemological tenets, at least to a certain extent, and its general worldview. Rather, he sought a way to reconcile historical relativism with a viable sense of universal ethics, truth, and religious life. And like a proper German philosopher, he proposed that the answer to the crisis of historicism required writing a 2-volume, 800-page analysis of the problem, and thereby historicism itself would provide a solution to this problem. Much like earlier historicists, he maintained that we can indeed discern the universal and enduring if we study history carefully. However, Trölsch then explicitly grounded this insight in God and believed in the universal or absolute. So his solution was ultimately theological, and would have been deemed philosophy of history by the earlier historicists. So while his approach has some similarities with earlier existential historicism, he still requires a transcendental category reaching towards the universal and ahistorical through theology. His solution to the problem of historicism could not fully rely on the kind of benevolent pluralism that earlier thinkers had appealed to in order to disclose the presence of something bigger, the unity behind diversity. The existential solace came ultimately for Trölsch from religion rather than historical contemplation. Heidegger, in turn, named the crisis of historicism as a pseudo-problem arising from the aporias of Western metaphysics, or more precisely from where it had gone astray, arguing that ultimately the rise of the problem of historicism is the clearest indication that historiography strives to alienate Dasein from its authentic historicity. Historicity does not necessarily require historiography. The possibility that historiography in general can be either an advantage or a disadvantage for life is based on the fact that life is historical in the roots of its being and has thus factically existing, always already decided upon authentic or inauthentic historicity. So Heidegger's critique of historicism in Being and Time, at least, is largely actually centered around Dilthey. So Heidegger appreciated Dilthey's insistence on historicity as a fundamental category of existence, but he rejected what he saw as Dilthey's so-called objectifying approach to history. The core of his criticism targeted exactly the aesthetic attitude of Dilthey's historicism, which he argued prevented Dilthey from fully breaking from the traditional subject-object distinction. As a result, Dilthey's approach to history remained epistemological, and it treated history as an object to be understood rather than an existentially primordial feature of Dasein. In contrast, Heidegger sought to recast the question of historicism in ontological terms and integrate it into his phenomenological existential Daseinsanalyse. In his critique of historicism, Heidegger in some ways radicalized Nietzsche's critique in the use and abuse of history for life. So as mentioned earlier, Nietzsche had already flagged how the aesthetic contemplation of antiquarian historicism was stifling for life. So in a similar vein, Heidegger argued that we need history that discloses itself temporarily in terms of the future. So historicity receives its meaning and indeed its ontological status from present and future possibilities. It exists within a continuum, not as something that can be treated as separate. So from Heidegger's writings, it's of course very difficult to understand precisely what he actually prescribes for our engagement with history versus what is intended as an ontological analysis or existential analysis. However, he seems to advocate a kind of mode of engaging with history or with the past that reveals possibilities rather than just recounts what has been. So this means that Heidegger clearly rejects detached historical contemplation, so the past must be actively radicalized in order to become meaningful for the present. History informs possible ways of being and frames what kind of people we can become. And as such, history is not only an object of knowledge, but a way for Dasein to define itself. And insofar as received history can be challenged, it can also be criticized or critiqued. And this opens new possibilities. Heidegger's ontological existential account of historicity would, in the 1930s, become increasingly political and not in a nice way. He defined authenticity and historicity in explicitly national historical terms and aligned the radicalization of history with a demand for collective intellectual and cultural renewal in Germany. In political terms, this called for situating oneself within the historical continuum of one's own folk, so people, and history. So historicity in Heidegger then shifted from, at least ideally, cosmopolitan tolerant framework of the previous generations towards an explicitly völkisch one. So völkisch meaning, well, basically National Socialist, but national kind of nationalistic historiography. Historicity then also functioned as a criterion for inclusion and exclusion within the German people. So a real community is something that is historically grown, and a folk is rooted in the historical community. Heidegger also explicitly denounced the political quietism of the historical contemplation and turned the existential analysis of historicity into a politically reactionary form of demand. So he called a radical renewal of German politics that would usher in a spiritual and political renewal. This made him see National Socialism as a promise and a force that could bring in a new world in which communities and people are created by actively appropriating the past. So, for example, in his 1933 inaugural rectoral address in Freiburg, Heidegger discusses the university's role in shaping the spiritual and historical identity of the German folk. So the political and existential significance of historicity was only possible if one abandoned aestheticism and distance and radicalized history into a framework that opens up the future. In Heidegger's case, this radicalization of history aligned it with the ideology of the Nazis. This was thankfully not the case with Walter Benjamin. He wrote his viscerally felt critique of the bourgeois conception of history in Thesis on the Philosophy of History. This essay was famously one of his final works, and it was composed just before he fled towards Spain, where the threat of being captured by the Nazis led him to take his own life, 26th of September, 1940. And this, of course, lends a special meaning to this very short but dense text. In thesis on the philosophy of history, Benjamin forcefully rejects the notion of history as a linear chain of events. He argues that this idea fosters a deceptive narrative of progress. Benjamin also rejects the aesthetic contemplation of the past, which similarly treats history as an orderly and harmonious narrative. He argues that historicism constructs a distorted image of the past, which serves the interests of the ruling class by hiding the violence and oppression that are woven into historical progress. Instead of an object for contemplation, Benjamin and the historical materialism he defends conceives history as a series of ruptures and destructions. He mocks the well-mannered bourgeois aestheticians of his own time for being shocked by the phenomena such as fascism, and the fact that something like fascism could still arise in the 20th century. So Benjamin argues that if one would look at history honestly, one would notice that it is exactly crisis and suffering that is the norm in history. Fascism is not new because violence and systems of oppression and power have always been the norm. Historicists like Ranke, Benjamin argues, and perhaps fairly, always end up fighting the history of the victors, the rulers and the ruling class. So their aestheticized vision obscures the suffering of those who are erased from history, and the bourgeois sensitivities blind themselves to the political imperatives that are embedded in historical research, or at least should be. The ideal of impartiality and objectivity merely make historicism blind to its own ideological foundations. Even the historicist's empathy and hermeneutic understanding are limited, Benjamin says, to empathizing and understanding the victor and the ruling classes. So instead of this aestheticized apolitical vision, Benjamin advocates for a more radical approach to history, one that highlights its meaning for the present. If one looks at history honestly and with actual empathy for the downtrodden, one does not see anything aesthetically pleasing. Rather, one should look into history to find ruptures and means for self-critique. So ultimately what Benjamin calls for is action. Tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule. We must attain to a conception of history that is in keeping with this insight. Then we shall clearly realize that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency, and this will improve our position in the struggle against fascism. So kind of interestingly, Heidegger and Benjamin strike similar chords. Both criticize the limits of passive aestheticized contemplation and the false consolations of existential historicism. Both call for a conception of history that opens up possibilities for renewal. The crux of both critiques is existential. What use is history for life as it is? Both also link this critique to political concerns, although of course radicalize them to very different directions. So for Heidegger, overcoming historicism meant turning historicity into a category that makes the past meaningful by disclosing future possibilities for Dasein. Benjamin radicalized historicism towards ethical and political awakening. History must make us confront oppression and crisis and therefore provoke action in the present. And for them, only in this register or only in this sense do history and historiography earn their claim to relevancy as frameworks for understanding life. I will end here. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Henriikka.
Stop sharing.
Yes, that would be useful. Let's see. Okay, now we have the discussion session as announced before. Is there any immediate questions, concerns, comments? I see a lot of clapping hands, but I don't see a risen hand yet. So, okay, there's one comment in the chat, and then there's one risen hand now. Maybe we start first with Josepina. She raised her hand, then we can check if Knife wants to give his own comments or I read it out. But please, Josepina, you first.
Hi, sorry, I won't put. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I won't put my camera on because I've got a terrible cold. Thank you very much for a very, very rich talk, and I'm sure that I could not quite digest it all. I suppose that I wanted to ask you well, I think maybe it's more like a clarification question about what you take to be the relation between historicism and relativism.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose I wasn't quite sure whether you were saying that in some way relativism is, there is an intrinsic relationship between historicism and relativism so that they cannot be separated, or whether you were not saying that. So, I mean, I suppose that if you were saying it, were you saying that?
Yes, I think there is
Okay.
You cannot have a non-relative. Yeah, I mean,
okay.
I can clarify it a bit more, but yes, I think there is an intrinsic relationship, yes.
Okay, so in that case, I'll continue with the question because I didn't want it to be based on a complete misunderstanding. So, so I suppose that presumably, I suppose there's something in that claim that I might find, slightly uncomfortable, in the sense that it would seem to suggest that insofar as, one of the important aspects of historicism, at least if I understood correctly, is an epistemic claim for the autonomy of historical understanding, and, the claim that is different from scientific understanding and so on, that somehow you cannot, and then of course that has sort of its implications, ontological implications, presumably for what the subject matter of the historical sciences is. But what it would seem to suggest is that then you cannot you cannot tease apart that kind of defense of the autonomy of history and the idea that, and the form of contextualism that, the idea that you need to understand the past in terms of its own zeitgeist, that you cannot somewhat separate that idea, so that when you approach nature, you don't approach it from a perspective of a particular zeitgeist. In a way, the laws of nature apply everywhere to the past, present, and future. But when you study the past, on the other hand, you want to understand it in terms of its own norms and so on. So why is it that you think that you cannot tease those two elements of historicism apart? Why is it that we cannot say that historical understanding, or the historical, that is, as its own goals, as its own method, without saying that necessarily lands you into some form of relativism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll try to answer. I'm not quite sure if I got your worry complete, but just tell me if I didn't answer it at all. Okay. So the relativism question is just something that always is kind of associated with historicism, and this is kind of what, especially the neo-Kantian critics, were kind of, and also the philosophical critics, people like Hegel. But I mean, Hegel is a bit of a different. Let's not go there now. But like kind of this philosophical critics use this historicism implies relativism critique a lot. So that's why I think it just like always comes. And I think the reason why you cannot sort of have a non-relativist historicism is the ontological aspect of historicism, which just like takes that there is like no ahistorical essence that you could discern. I mean, this is like where the kind of the playing room with existential historicism is, and why historicism is kind of confused. Why I think it's more like a life attitude than it is like a strict philosophical, systematic theory. Because I mean, everybody invokes this idea of universalism behind diversity without committing to the idea that there are absolute values. But when I say absolute, I mean like absolute in the sense of like neo-Kantians mean absolute, that there is something like a universal moral values, for example. And this is something that historicists would always be against. If your sort of worry was more about this classic like historicism refutes itself, because a historian is always like also embedded in a certain like zeitgeist when they are studying history. This is just something that most historicist thinkers in the 19th century did not really think about. And I think it's a very valid criticism of their position. But it's just also something that kind of ultimately, I don't think becomes like much more, like it's not more of a problem than claiming that there are absolute values when you have to also just like kind of, so the kind of the meta-historical level of historicism is a bit shaky. I'm not saying that it isn't, but I don't think it's much like less shaky than say that of neo-Kantianism and so on. But yeah, my project is very much like trying to understand what the historicists in the 19th century said. So that's why I'm sort of like dodging your questions about like the systematic.
Right. But if I may, I suppose what I would like to do is to challenge a little bit that assumption that because when we look at the past, we might be confronted with different values, with values that are different from our own, that therefore one cannot criticize them, because it seems to me that there is a division of labor between the job of the historian who understands, so I think that to say that that you cannot criticize the past just because you have to endorse a form of relativism, just because you accept that the values of the past might be different from the values of the present. It just doesn't follow. Bernard Williams puts it like this. He says he denounces that as the kind of the fallacy of the fat oxen. He says some people believe that the person who drives the fat oxen cart must himself be fat. And it doesn't follow. So it doesn't mean that if I understand historical agents and I understand what they believe to be the case, it doesn't follow that I have to believe that what they believe is true. So, I guess that I would like to say that, I mean, I take it, I don't know enough about the whole history of the criticism, but what I would say is that perhaps, although that might be an historical assumption that has been made, perhaps it should be put under some pressure. And it may not necessarily be the case that that people commit that. And in fact, a lot of the defenses of the autonomy of the human sciences in the Anglo-American context, for example, have not equally made that kind of connection between, understanding the past in its own context and agreeing or yielding to a form of historical relativism.
This was, I briefly mentioned the Heinrich Leo versus Ranke debate and also the Schlosser controversy. And these were exactly like different conceptions of history debating about like whether moral judgments about historical agents are permitted. I mean, Ranke very much defended the view that it's not like you cannot, like you have to understand Machiavelli in his context and therefore you cannot make moral judgments. I guess as a private person, you could make moral judgments, but as a historian, your job is to understand Machiavelli in his context and why it made sense for him to, like why he acted like that in the context.
But that is not relativism, is it? Relativism is the claim is that you cannot, nobody can judge a belief that what is true or false or what is right is wrong.
Well, I guess it depends, because I think the debates around relativism that I'm sort of historicism, relativism, the worry was very much, especially from the Kantian camp, about moral relativism rather than epistemic relativism. Of course, these debates are very kind of complicated, and of course, there was overlap, but kind of the relativism concern in the 19th century was, I think, more about moral relativism and these implications rather than the epistemic questions. But yes, it's an interesting, but I think more complicated question whether like judgments about like how the world is and so on, like to what extent historicists would have kind of granted that there is some sort of relativism there. But for example, Dilthey's conception of worldviews was very much like there are these worldviews that are just incommensurable, like naturalism versus like somebody who is very religious, or idealism. These are two incommensurable worldviews, but both of them can reveal some sort of truth And that's why we need historicism, because we can sort of see the truth in both of these things. This sort of like absolutist, like this sort of worldviews that claim, of course, that they have absolute knowledge. So in that sense, there is a commitment to relativism. Of course,
But the relativism.
Josie, we have to leave it for now. Sorry,
thank you very much. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the questions.
We can take it up later, maybe, but there are 6 more people, I think, now that I have counted on the list. So I think, which is great. I think the next was before Joni, Matti, and Arto, there was Naif who wrote his question and comment into the chat. So I suppose he cannot speak. So I will quickly read it out loud for our recording. Spengler argued that our inability to define a specific phenomenon doesn't only reflect our lack of understanding of it, but the fact that we might be swayed by its forces. Hence, why naming something unknown in primitive cultures was a form of controlling that thing. The same would apply for exorcisms and demons. In the case of historicism, perhaps it reflects a unique German historical paradigm, as Iggers and others have argued, that possessed German historiography and history in a Faustian manner. We still fail to provide a proper definition of historicism, its connection to historism, and the conflation of the term in the other uses, Popper and Berlin. As for my question, what in your judgment is the link between historicism and speculative philosophy of history? Okay, so it was a longer comment and related or perhaps unrelated question, please.
Just briefly about the Faustian thing. I mean, I don't think that there is anything like essentially Faustian about Germany. It's just like was a cultural, to be clear, like what I'm saying, because I mean, I've also been reading Spengler now, and he also famously claims that the German culture or the Western culture itself is Faustian. But what I'm saying is that Faust was this sort of kind of idea that could be a kind of a grab bag for many kind of ideals in Germany in the 19th century, and also in the early 20th century. Yes, it is true that historicism has been defined in so many ways, and sometimes Hegel is defined as a historicist. Popper's Property of Historicism is also, yes, uses the term very in an original manner. So what I informed by my sort of research on Dilthey and Ranke, and especially like Ranke reception and so on, the understanding in the 19th century I maintain was that speculative history is something that historicism was against. Historicism is what the historical school was doing, and the historical school was explicitly anti-Hegelian because they were against this idea of imposing meta-historical narratives into history. And that was kind of the claim for historicism, the claim that historicism had for independence of historical knowledge. So I would say that they are like two different, that historicism was a reaction against speculative philosophy of history or idealist philosophy of history.
Great. Next we got Joni, Matti, then Arthur, then myself, and then Ali Barek, then perhaps others, if there's still time and energy. Please, Joni, Matti.
Okay, I need to check if you can hear me. Do you?
Yes.
And
because
see you.
I'm on a car, so it's a bit strange. I may need to write, but I have the camera off. Thanks a lot for your talk. Really rich and very interesting. I would have a couple of questions, and I ask a few of them.
Okay.
And the first is really about, in the terms of history of ideas, how would you describe the notion of existential historicism? Is it, because I noticed that it's a really long stretch of time that you apply it to. And so can we describe it as a movement or as an orientation, or is it just a concept that happens to be applicable to a number of thinkers?
Mm-hmm.
I go with, this is my...
Okay.
Do you hear?
Yeah. Okay. No, that's a good question, because I mean, my use of, like, when I say concept, that's maybe like unclear a little bit. And I also am not very happy how I sort of presented this, because it is true that if I do like an intellectual historical or even philosophical historical claim, it's not really the concept but sort of like, it's like, that's why I'm talking about analyst's concept, that I think the analyst's concept, like a concept like historicism, also the existential historicism, describes meaningfully something that was going on in the 19th century and then sort of like was criticized in the early 20th century. So that's kind of, so it's yeah, I mean, is it a movement? I think for movement you would need like people who know that they are part of a movement. But it is kind of, well, a sense-making paradigm I chose because it, I think, sort of grasps what I try to express with existential historicism, and I think it's kind of a sense-making paradigm that existed roughly from the 1820s and sort of like, because it, as you said, it's a long stretch of time, but it's like still there is this German conception of historicism, as many historians of philosophy and historians of historiography have kind of identified, and part of this German conception of history was existential historicism. It's of course not everybody, but it is a meaningful kind of chunk of people, and it is kind of a phenomenon that needs to be analyzed. That's my motivation for this talk.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave it at this point. I'll post some questions chat later. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Next is Arthur, then me, and then Ali.
Well, hi everybody. Henriikka, thanks for the presentation and congratulations for having the courage of putting your hands into this can of worms that is the discussions about historicism. I will concentrate on one issue. I have a lot of notes here, but I think there is more people willing to talk. So I would pick simply the shorter one, which is regarding this use of what you call analysts categories as opposed to actors categories. I mean, in the case of, let's forget existential historicism and focus on historicism only. I mean, in the case of Ranke and Burkhardt, I think it applies very well. I mean, this is an analyst's category because neither Ranke nor Burkhardt actually used historicism. But in the case of Dilthey, it's a bit more complicated, as you surely know, because, I mean, the word historicism was a common term in Dilthey's time, and Dilthey himself sort of was accused of being a historicist in the sense of someone who embraced moral relativism. So that makes the idea of a purely analyst category a bit more complicated. How do you account for that?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
No, yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, that's a good question. The Dilthey himself, I don't think uses I think he once uses the term historicism in his oeuvre. But he does use I mean, he, as I said, kind of declares himself as the philosopher of the historical school. And I take that what he takes to be the historic conception of history of the historical school is what is historicism. I think he's like, I haven't done like perfect analysis on this on the whole 19th century, but I think historicism as a category only really came into existence in the late 19th century, I would say 1890s, and kind of more than that in the early 20th century. And I think for Dilthey, sort of when he got accused of it, it was by Husserl. Maybe the neo-Kantians already used it, I'm not, but I think they were mostly talking about relativism. But Husserl used that, and that was a year before Dilthey died. So in that sense, I don't think it's in that. So I think it emerged as a category, also as this sort of Kampfwort. How do you say? What is it called? Kampfbegriff in the turn of the century. And then there were histories of historicism written in the 20s and 30s by Trölsch and Meinecke. So it's a bit like Lebensphilosophie is another word that only sort of emerges in the 20s and 30s. And yes, some of these people who were accused of being historicists or Lebensphilosophen were still alive, but it was still more emerged as a bit of a Streitbegriff kind of in the turn of the century. So that would be my account. But if you have hard evidence about the use, then I would be very happy to get it. So.
Okay, then I think next it was me, and then it's Ali. So I have a question on also the concept of existential historicism. I think you called it an ethos and perhaps a general worldview, for the lack of a better
Yeah.
term. And presumably it lost all its sheen. It lost what it had. So then there were other contenders for it. You gave me at the beginning of 20th century, the first one, Troeltsch, was historical. Then perhaps Heidegger had two of them, one Völkisch and one whatever you call it. I wrote down presentist, possibilist, but I don't understand Heidegger very well. So
that's very analytic
let's
for
take
Heidegger.
let's take it at that. And then one is historical materialism in the sense
Yeah.
as the late Benjamin has brought it up. So then the question is, then we have historicism more as an epistemological and ontological position, which then is probably what I would call the bread and butter of historiography, by which they produce knowledge of the past. So if all of them presumably, I mean, if there's so many contenders of what is the best worldview or ethos of the discipline, are all of them equally compatible with what historiography is? Is any of them better than the other? And if any of them is better than the other as the worldview of properly for historians, how do we find out that one is better than the other? And maybe as part of that too, do you think today historians still have such a ethos or worldview? Or is it so all over the place? Or maybe even back then, just because certain German historians were very hegemonial, perhaps in the discipline, and also in the global historical profession, that then historicism, existential historicism, you looked more hegemonial than it was back then too. So the question is, what would be the equivalent of existential historicism today, if it exists? If it, and then the subordinate question would be, maybe it wasn't as hegemonial back there, so there were always a lot of contenders for this meaning making.
Thank you.
So that's
yes. I think I got it. Yes.
Thank you.
I mean, as to the 19th century, yes, there were of course other contenders. Like this was like the speculative philosophy of history was one, like a Kantian ideas of historiography, where history is supposed to teach you moral norms. So that's why kind of ethical engagement with history is important. So there were these ideas, and they were also like historians were involved in these bitter like fights about like what historiography is. And that of course continued also in the history of the like social sciences and so on, like this sort of scholarly debates, and that ultimately then come sort of like they have this that ultimately then are about like what is the identity or what is the thing that we're doing. So methodological discussions versus this sort of meaning-making frameworks are, of course, I mean, it's complicated, but yes, anyway. So it was already complicated in the 19th century, even though I do think that there was some sort of cultural hegemony within like German academia and this sort of like Bildungsbürger mindset, as like Fritz Ringer has written this book about like Bildungsbürger in the 19th century, kind of sociological study. So I think there was like a monoculture in a different way than there is today. And also, of course, in Germany, there was like a monoculture. As to the critics of historicism, like I framed of the three, I mean, I have no idea how kind of Heideggerian historiography would look like, and I don't think I want to. So in that sense, I don't think his critique was in any sense trying to like prescribe anything for historiography. And to what extent he did, it became like politically right wing and like National Socialist. So clearly not the best sort of framework. I think Benjamin has, and his historical materialism has a lot like to offer to modern historians. But at the same time, I don't think that any of these three were sort of trying to give a new vision for historiography. They were just like reacting to the crisis that they saw about historical knowledge and like what it meant, exactly because it had been so important in the 19th century, and that's why they sort of reacted against it. And for today, I mean, I don't know, to some extent, I feel like I like existential historicism because as a historian of philosophy, I think that it is nice to sort of like look at history and be inspired and feel like, you know, you have, that it has something to offer to you and to people that are reading it. But Yeah, I mean, I think it would be interesting to do some sort of sociological study about like what sort of values historians see for themselves and what kind of like why are they doing what they're doing? Is there any sort of but yeah, it might be lost to this sort of methodological debates and like because I feel like modern historiography is very method oriented. So maybe it doesn't have this sort of overarching normative existential meaning. Yeah, this is really
Okay. Thank you very
just
much.
trying to answer something. I don't know.
Existential Historicism, a project for the 21st century. Sounds like a
Exactly.
great work for a paper or maybe a research project. Anyway, next is Ali, and then Yoni-Matti wrote some questions in the chat again. Maybe everybody else can have questions too. Please, Ali, you're next.
Hello.
Yes, hello.
Okay, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I actually I am a history student, and Rangpain is essentially a term of abuse for us. So it was destabilizing in the best way to see so much of the discipline's current practice in your account of Ranke and Dilthey and Burckhardt. I want to ask about any other attempts to recover this vision of the historicist that you've encountered. In particular, the one I'm thinking of is another Frankfurt School type, Marcuse's early work, Hegel's Ontology and the Theory of Historicity, where he does this, where he attempts to ground Dilthey's concept of historicity in Hegelian ontology and do this like very interesting. I mean, he also, of course, tries to bring Heidegger in. It's a really careful balancing act that the young Marcuse is a tightrope that he's trying to walk there. But I mean, this attempt to center being, acting, and becoming in like the concrete possibilities and necessities of a particular lived historical context seems like a project that's consonant with yours in some way in the attempt to like define this analytical category of existential history. And I wanted to know if perhaps you had anything to say maybe about Marcuse in specific, or more generally, if you have found if there have been other attempts to like reckon with the afterlife of the historicist project that aren't just in this crisis of historicism way an attempt to explain its failure or like see it, or like I see it as providing some sort of resources for thinking through the problem of history that you found.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The Ranke thing is interesting. I think I read somewhere that it would have been Hayden White's like Ranke interpretation that has sort of become the standard in especially Anglophone history, like teaching of history, kind of Ranke as this sort of naive objectivist. And yes, that is just blatantly not true, kind of about Ranke. But I mean, I also studied history, and I remember seeing like this Ranke picture. But yes, I haven't read the Marcuse thing. Now I've written it down and it's on my list, so I should probably look into it. My feeling is, not having not read everything, obviously, that philosophically speaking, I think this existential historicism really was left in the 19th century. Because, I mean, of course, the idea of historicism and kind of of course, it sort of comes back. And also this question about like Hegel's relationship to historicism later, it's also a very complicated one because, of course, Hegel makes history a very important part of his inquiry. And Dilthey also took a lot from Hegel, although only from 1890s onwards. So his sort of like conception of historicism earlier was very anti-Hegelian, as I laid out. So it becomes very complicated if you take this existential historicism as something more than a historical category that refers to specifically to the 19th century, because that's what I was trying to do. But sort of, and also like what you said about the Frankfurt School, I would have imagined, I haven't read the Marcuse book, as I said, I would have imagined that they would have went into a more Benjaminian direction with this sort of like a more historical materialism. But maybe that's not the case with Marcuse. That might be the case. But of course, there are very interesting books about the kind of the aesthetic conception of history in the 19th century that are written by historians of philosophy or historians of historiography. I can definitely recommend the Beiser book as a very good start, the German conception, the German historicist tradition, it's called. And then, yeah, that's, I think, kind of introduces these debates very well and this sort of idea of what history was in the 19th century. Yeah,
Thank you.
but then thanks for the recommendation. I will look into the Marcuse book, definitely.
Okay, I think we are also open for second rounds now, but anybody who hasn't spoken yet, of course, can also raise their hands because Matti put two questions in the chat. I will read, maybe we can go with one first and see if there's somebody else before. The first question of Matti, I read it again for the recording. Is existential historicism similar to the Ankasmithian idea of narrativism, historicism? The nature of an object is its trajectory. Thus, in order to understand what something X is, one needs to study how X came about. No non-historical essences. I try to generalize this in one paper about historicism.
I mean, yes, but that would also be the same for Nietzsche's genealogical approach. So that's why it's not really unique to this kind of historicism that the historical school was. But yeah, I mean, Nietzsche, again, it's like, it's difficult when you sort of like tease out these things. Then it becomes, everybody becomes a historicist, but like, yes, generally, yes, that's kind of the idea of like the ontological part of historicism is exactly the thing that like what X is explained through its history, basically. It might also then later become its function in society, so in sort of more social science terms of like more social sciences understanding, but yes, generally that would be kind of the idea. Yes. I feel fairly confident saying yes. Not knowing Anka Smith that well.
There's a second question of Matti, but if somebody else has a set question before. Is it Arthur too? Okay, because you raised your physical hand, not your Zoom hand, but I saw it. So maybe Arthur next. We're a bit advanced, but we still have a bit of time. I would also have a second question if there's time. That's the only my second question. We'll see how far we get. Please, Arthur first.
Thank you, Georg. Well, let's get back then to this idea, Henriikka, that the essential operation for existential historicism is contemplation. Mm-hmm. Contemplation has a sort of passive aura. I mean, it's not a concept of action. It's a concept of, let's say, non-action, and that remains in a strong contrast with, let's say, with the whole with most of the historiographical tradition, which defines history as a sort of practical knowledge. I mean, it's not all this tradition, but for the most part, historians, rhetoricians, philosophers have defined, in the long run, history as a sort of practical knowledge. I mean, a school for politics, or a knowledge on which to base moral decisions. Mm-hmm. Well, contemplation sort of shifts this, and it seems to shift the situation quite strongly. But I think there is, in the vocabulary of German idealism and post-idealist tradition, there is a concept which I think is, I mean, inside these thoughts by Ranke, Burkhardt, and Dilthey, and which provides a sort of compensation for this passive approach. And the concept is Bildung, I think. Mm. Don't you think that Bildung mitigates the passive aspect of contemplation and reintroduces, in a way that is very difficult to describe, but it reintroduces a component of action in historical thought? What do you think?
Yes, I would agree completely. I mean, that said, I do think that this historicism generally, and especially like existential historicism, does mean certain, like especially political quietism that was exactly then criticized by people like Benjamin, but also people like Lukács. Sort of like that is in the DNA of historicism, that it becomes kind of politically toothless. And also this was kind of the moral question about the moral relativism thing, that, you know, Schlosserian historians or Kantian historians would be like, we have to look at history exactly to get like get like moral education, while the historicist historians would have sort of looked at history and exactly in this sort of more vague idea of Bildung, sort of like study history and you become a better, like more informed person. And if you know a lot about history, you understand humans better, and therefore you kind of can build, well, as you also mentioned, like Dilthey has, like in a speech, I think he, and in his lectures about about education, because he did teach pedagogy. This becomes like very explicit that he sort of believes that yes, if you study history, you become a better person, and then you can make more informed decisions. And if we do this on a societal level, it leads to better kind of society. But at the same time, like it's never very concrete, and it's never a very inspiring vision for the future. It's just like everybody becomes a historian and reads a lot of books. I think that's kind of the ideal world for these people, which is, I mean, sounds nice to me, but it's not maybe the most of the strongest call for action. And this was kind of why it was criticized by people like Nietzsche and Benjamin and so on. But yes, it introduces some sort of like take back control about your kind of life and future.
Okay, great. Since I had a question exactly on contemplation too, I might jump into the second question. Then there's Joni Marti's third question, if there's still time, and maybe some others. Then we soon close. Just very short. Firstly, what's the German term for contemplation that is? It's just Kontemplation? Is it a specific
No,
different term that they...
I think it was Anschauung, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not
That-
perfect translation.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's interesting itself. I would never have come up with that term, but okay. But that's a different question then. Okay, thank you. So then my question is again, okay, so there are the historicists who think contemplation has a lot of positive effects. I mean, I don't know, this detachment. Maybe it leads to empathy, it leads to understanding of previous times. Of course, understanding is a double-edged sword. It can mean just understanding what they're doing, but understanding can also mean, to understand everything means to forgive everything, and so forth. And so too much understanding, perhaps. And then there are all these critics, Nietzsche, of course, Heidegger, um, and Benjamin, who somehow think contemplation is intrinsically wrong, or so there's something wrong with it. Maybe it's like hackneyed or bourgeois, as in Benjamin. It gives you maybe knowledge of some people, not even that, but not the right kind, not the downtrodden and so forth. And then it might be wrong because it doesn't serve life, as in Nietzsche, then you get away totally from historiography and whatever Heidegger wants to do, later Völkisch, before Dasein. Again, what to make of this controversy? How to solve it? Is anybody right on them? I mean, prima facie, I would think detachment or whatever it is, no, sorry, contemplation gives you all of that, right? I mean, you need to detach yourself a bit to produce historiographic knowledge, and all the other things are different question. Who do you produce knowledge about? What else do you find important? Life, story, folk, whatever else. There's a question of values then, right? The rest. Is that? Do you understand what I mean? Is that
I
sort
mean,
of, does it make sense?
I mean, I'm going to retreat to my usual sort of, I'm a historian of philosophy, so, I'm just like trying to understand what people say rather than sort of taking necessarily a strong stance, like what I believe, because I haven't figured it out. I mean, as I said, I'm drawn to the idea of historical contemplation in theory, but I also recognize that it's a very sort of like it was maybe only possible really for like a certain Bildungsbürger guy in the 19th century and their sort of like aesthetic sensibilities. So I think it's like, in that sense, it's a very specific vision to a certain segment of population. And I mean, I think that the kind of their historicism as such, I think that would be like a hill that I would die on. I think historicism itself is like a good way of looking at historiography as kind of general worldview. But I also see the merits of kind of the criticism of especially Benjamin, kind of, and Nietzsche also, like to sort of like the way we do history or we relate to historicity and history needs to somehow inform us today. And especially in a time of crisis, as was the case in the 30s and 40s, or especially in the 30s, Benjamin died in 1940. And maybe, in our time, it's, I think, good to sort of like not necessarily just retreat to this sort of aesthetic contemplation about the past and sort of academic ivory tower, but also look at history in what ways that can inform us in the present. But how to do that is, of course, a different thing, because I think also the certain kind of ideal of impartiality that is baked into historicism. And this sort of idea of contemplation is also worth like keeping as a part of like historiographical practice. So yes, it's a blend. Everybody gets something right, as a good historicist would say.
Great. Okay, then there's still second question of Yoni Matti. I'll read out again, and maybe thereafter we soon come to the end. But there's just one more hand, so there's one more question after that. Perhaps, and maybe more. We'll see, but not too many more. Okay, now the second question written and the first question in total of Yoni Matti. It would be great to understand what universal ambitions without universal foundations is, and even better if it's a coherent intellectual approach. Many arguments that argue against universalism have to face the question whether everything is historically contingent relatively to something, or is there something that forms a shared universal category, after all, such as rationality. Okay, very philosophical again.
Yes,
Okay,
thank you. I think historicism does run the risk of not being coherent in that sense. It also has this sort of general relativism kind of undermines itself refutation, where a historian like, well, I mean, Dilthey is my go-to example because I know most about him, but like because he says basically that does historiography and says that everything else is relative, but basically he's still like doing historiography and philosophy within his own like a specific context and doesn't see a problem with that. So that would be kind of one problem with historicism, and I don't think it's easy to solve. I don't think, I mean, Dilthey definitely does not believe in universal, like rationality in the sense of like there's a Kantian would. So it's not a transcendental category. What his solution is, and I think what would be shared by many historicists, is some sort of anthropological universalism, where the kind of the idea of what is universal, what is rationality, is not based on sort of categorical principles. They are not absolute in that sense, but because we are certain kinds of people who feel things, think things, and will things, or volitional beings. So we have this sort of structure of like what it is to be human. Like there are these three things. We're just like certain kinds of beings in a certain kind of world. Then we end up developing certain categories of thought. So that would be the shared basis of rationalism. Or like what is rational thinking within this particular world. Like an alien might have a completely different kind of rationality in Dilthey's picture. And I think that would sort of be the general vibe of like historicist and like answer to this question, because one also has to think that when it's like universalism, when people in the 19th century think about universalism, I think it's always a Kantian category like is lurking behind, that it's something that is absolute, something that is categorical, and something that is sort of like beyond history itself. And if we want to be on this level of historicity and historicism, just look at everything empirically, then kind of the universalism only can be based on anthropology and be like an empirical notion. I hope this clarified it a little bit.
Okay, great. So I think the last question of the day goes to Eri Dominique. I hope I pronounced that correctly, please.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
I believe my question is very related to what he was asking. Also, like how the concept of universal history will fit into this discussion, because I remember having a huge discussion with a Hegelian. He was very in his mind that it can be a sort of universal history, or this concept can fit in the activity of writing history. And in my case, I am more educated in history, so well, as a historian, and it's very hard to talk about the concept of universal history with historians, because because it's hard to imagine one way to write history, but also to write or understand history. But also, for example, I don't know what you think about this. I recently I've been learning about present time history, and I had this situation that I was with different historians, and they were all talking about present time events, no events in our present. And at certain point, I started to realize why are historians. I started to ask myself why are historians studying events that are in our present, and how is this related to our past? And for me, I felt this emptiness in the understanding of the human events. For example, we can study with really good methodologies the history, or with really good methodologies, but at the same time not putting it into not putting these events in a narrative of a human existence. So, what do you think about the idea of not only creating one concept, or only one way to understand the universal? I don't know how to put it. I don't know how to put it. There is one way to understand universal history, or do you think that we can understand a big a way to understand the historical events in big narratives, or in this big narrative of human existence? I don't know if I am being very clear.
I'll try to. I'm trying to understand what you mean with universal history, because I have there are different conceptions, but do you mean something like this sort of grand narrative of humanity
more
as a
in a
whole?
Hegelian, and in
Or a
Hegelian
modern
way,
version would be something like this Harari stuff would be kind of universal history, no?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, or I mean, making or Spengler's Untergang, the decline of the West, I think would be also universal history, that it sort of makes a claim about history as a whole and it tries to yes. So if I understand, if that's the conception of universal history, historicism would have been against it, because it would have been exactly sort of like imposing kind of ideas, philosophical ideas onto history that are too grand and too speculative and do not follow from the source material. And so in this sort of historicist idea, that would have been impermissible. And that's why I think that people like Ranke and Dilthey would have been against Spengler, they would have been against Harari, and were against Hegel or Marx and so on. So, and I think I kind of, in this sense, agree with these historicists, with Ranke and Burkhardt and Dilthey, that if you sort of zoom out too much, then you cannot do the sort of nitty-gritty historical work that I think is kind of constitutive of the historian's craft, which is just like looking at the sources and what they say and trying to understand very much what they say within one context. I mean, I know that I also just made a very grand narrative about 100 years of history, but I hope that kind of I hope it's not too world historical now, too universal history. And also Dilthey very clearly and explicitly, at least, denounces universal history and equates it with Hegelian history. So for him, kind of speculative philosophy of history and universal history were the same thing. So very clearly, his own approach was against that. So.
Okay, maybe these are very nice closing words. It will be the judgment of the future to decide about the world historical significance of your talk today.
Yeah,
We'll see.
exactly.
Yes, thank you very much all for coming. I'll just leave you, and thank you mostly to Henriikka for her talk. We'll reconvene, as I said before, on the 4th of December with Ephraim Wallach speaking about "Is the Past Real?" Thank you very much.